Welcome to the A la Mode podcast,
where stories meet substance.
and bold conversations push beyond the surface.
She's Madison Taylor.
And he's Aiden Cole.
Let's dive in.
Today we're looking into a truly compelling and frankly pretty disturbing story, that of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Yeah, it's quite something.
We've got a really important set of documents here. There's a Supreme Court record, some deep legal analysis from Lawfare, Wikipedia info, and then a bunch of news reports from places like Politico, AP News, NPR, WGLT, and News 3.
And what we want to do in this deep dive is really try to understand the different layers here.
Go beyond just the headlines.
Exactly. We need to look at who Kilmar Abrego Garcia was before all this, before the arrest and deportation.
Okay.
Then the really troubling circumstances around his actual removal from the U.S.
Right.
And the conditions he's facing now, which are, well, exceptionally harsh. And crucially, why the legal questions this whole thing brings up could matter to, well, everyone living in the U.S.
Absolutely. Because this isn't just an immigration story, is it? It really touches on fundamental ideas about how government works and, the rights we all expect to have.
That's the core of it.
Okay, so let's start, like you said, with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the person. He wasn't just a name on a court filing. He had a history, a life.
That's right. So Kilmar's story, it begins back in El Salvador. His family, they owned a small business, a pupuseria, called Pupuseria Cecilia.
Local restaurant.
Yeah, sort of a cornerstone for them. But unfortunately, it became a target for the Barrio 18 gang.
Which is a notoriously violent group.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And they started extorting the family. First, it was monthly payments, but then it escalated, became weekly demands.
And it wasn't just money. The threats were personal.
Oh, yeah. Direct threats of harm against Kilmar, his sisters, his older brother Caesar, if the family didn't pay up.
Wow.
And it gets worse. The gang actually tried to recruit Caesar.
Recruit him?
Yeah, they offered to stop the extortion if the family just surrendered him to the gang.
And they refused.
They refused, which, imagine the bravery that took.
Incredible. But that must have had consequences.
Immediate ones. Gang members actually came into their home, threatened Caesar directly, right there, until Kilmar's father paid them off.
Just terrifying. Constantly living in fear.
Absolutely. And soon after that, they sent Caesar to the U.S., presumably to get him out of danger.
But that didn't stop the gang.
Sadly, no. With Caesar gone, they just shifted their focus. They started trying to recruit Kilmar.
The same pattern.
Exactly. Threatened to kill him unless the family paid this so-called rent, or if they turned Kilmar over. And again, the family paid, trying to protect him.
Did they try to move to get away?
They did. They moved twice, but the gang found them. The threats just followed them. Even after the pupuseria had to close down because of all this, the threats against Kilmar and his sisters, they just continued.
An inescapable nightmare, it sounds like.
Pretty much. So finally, around 2011, Kilmar's about 16 years old.
Right.
His family makes this incredibly tough decision to send him to the United States.
Hoping he'd be safe here.
Hoping he could build a life, free from that terror. He entered the U.S. without inspection, so, without going through the formal channels.
Okay, so he arrives in the U.S. What kind of life did he build here? Was he trying to stay hidden?
Not at all, actually. He settled in Maryland, lives with his brother Caesar, who, by the way, is now a U.S. citizen.
Okay.
Kilmar got a work permit from DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and he worked in construction.
So he was working legally.
Yes, and he put down roots, got married, was raising 3 children, and the reports mention his kids all have disabilities.
So a family man contributing. How long was he here?
About 14 years, basically his entire adult life. And this is really important. Our sources are clear. He had 0 criminal record. None. Not in the U.S., not anywhere else.
0 criminal record. That's a key detail.
It's crucial, especially given what happened next. Because despite entering without authorization initially, he lived here over a decade. No crime. Then, in 2019, something significant happens legally.
What was that?
A U.S. immigration judge granted him withholding of removal to El Salvador.
Okay, let's pause there. Withholding of removal, what does that actually mean?
It means the judge officially recognized that Kilmar had a well-founded fear of persecution if he were sent back to El Salvador.
Specifically from Barrio 18, the gang that had been terrorizing him.
Exactly that gang.
Right.
And another key point, the government did not challenge the validity of that judge's order.
So the government, through its own courts, agreed it was dangerous for him to go back.
Yes. The legal system acknowledged the danger, which makes what happened next just baffling and really concerning.
Right. Which brings us to the arrest and deportation. How could that happen with this protection order in place?
Well, he was deported, sent to El Salvador on March 15th, 2025. Now, according to Trump administration officials at the time, the justification given was this accusation from 2019 from local police in Maryland.
An accusation, not a charge.
An accusation, claiming he was a member of MS-13.
MS-13, another very dangerous gang. Okay, where did that accusation come from?
Reportedly from a confidential informant. And this informant claimed Abrego Garcia was part of an MS-13 clique operating out of Long Island, New York.
Long Island. But didn't you say he lived in Maryland?
Exactly. He'd never lived in New York.
That's a huge red flag right there.
Yeah.
What did Abrego Garcia say about this?
He completely denied it. Denied ever being in a gang.
And critically, was he ever charged, ever convicted of anything related to this accusation?
No. Never charged with any crime. And like we said, no criminal convictions on his record at all.
So, let me get this straight. A man with a legal court order protecting him from deportation to El Salvador is deported anyway, based on an unproven accusation from an unnamed source about gang activity in a place he never lived.
That's the situation, yes. It sounds unbelievable, but that's what the sources lay out.
Has the government explained how this happened?
They have. The U.S. government acknowledges he had that withholding order. They admit it forbade his removal to El Salvador.
So they admit that deportation was illegal.
Yes. They concede it was illegal, calling it an administrative error.
An administrative error. That phrase seems woefully inadequate for the consequences.
It does, because it wasn't just a paperwork mix-up. It's a failure to follow a direct court order, and it landed him in, well, an incredibly dangerous place.
Where is he being held now in El Salvador?
He's in the Centro del Confinamiento del Terrorismo, CICOT.
The Terrorism Confinement Center. Even the name sounds grim.
It is, and it's drawn a lot of international criticism. The reports about the conditions inside are deeply troubling.
What are people saying? What did the judge say about it?
Well, U.S. District Judge Paula Sinas, in a related case, she didn't mince words. She called CICOT one of the most notoriously inhumane and dangerous prisons in the world.
That's from a U.S. judge.
Yes, and she cited credible evidence suggesting detainees there are, and I'm quoting here, highly likely to face immediate and intentional life-threatening harm at the hands of state actors.
Life-threatening harm from the guards, the state itself.
That's the implication of her statement, yes. It's not just about bad conditions, it's about active danger.
What are the specific conditions like?
Reports consistently mention things like inadequate food, water, shelter, and routine violence is apparently common.
And it's huge.
Massive! Capacity for 40,000 inmates. As of mid-2024, it held over 14,500, but numbers might be closer to capacity now.
40,000. What's the place actually look like?
It sounds like a fortress. 19 guard towers, high concrete walls, barbed wire everywhere, electrified fences. Even the ground inside is gravel, apparently to make it harder to move quietly.
And the cells?
The cells are designed to hold about 156 inmates each.
156 people in one cell. What are the facilities?
Bare minimum. Metal bunks, but no mattresses. Just 2 toilets and 2 wash basins for all those people.
2 toilets for 156 people.
That's what's reported. And the lights are on 20/47. Constant CCTV surveillance, armed guards.
Do they ever get out of the cells?
Very rarely. Reports say maybe 30 minutes a day. And that's just for basic exercise, maybe Bible study sometimes, or if they have an online court hearing, or if they're put in solitary.
No education, recreation, visits, calls.
None of that. No education, no recreation, no family visits allowed, no phone calls. It's almost total isolation from the outside world.
What about food? Basic survival.
Very basic. Rice, beans, eggs, pasta, often served without any utensils.
And is there any hope of getting out? Rehabilitation?
Apparently not. The Salvadoran government has reportedly said they don't plan to release any prisoners from CICOT. No rehab programs. It suggests indefinite confinement in these conditions.
Indefinite confinement. And Judge Sianis made a point about the specific danger to Abrego Garcia in this particular prison, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She highlighted that putting him in CICOT constitutes irreparable harm, especially because CICOT houses members of Barrio 18.
The very gang he fled from.
The very gang. So, because of this administrative error, he's been sent right back into the lion's den, effectively, facing threats from the exact people the U.S. court system said he needed protection from.
This just raises so many legal alarms. What about the Supreme Court? They got involved, right?
They did, to an extent. The Supreme Court issued an order, but it was carefully worded. They told the Trump administration to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return.
Facilitate. That doesn't sound like a direct command.
Exactly. They stopped short of explicitly ordering the government to bring him back. And that distinction, facilitate versus order, has become a huge point of legal argument.
And Justice Sotomayor had some strong words about the government's position.
She did, a very powerful statement. She argued that the way the government was arguing its case essentially implied the executive branch could just deport and jail anyone, even U.S. citizens, without consequence, as long as they did it quickly before a court could step in.
Wait, so the argument is basically act first, deal with the courts later.
That was the implication Sotomayor was pointing out. She said that view refutes itself, basically calling it absurd and fundamentally against the rule of law.
That is a chilling idea, that the government could just bypass the courts by acting fast enough. What does this mean for due process?
It raises profound concerns. Here you have Abrego Garcia, deported with no charge, no conviction, despite a court order protecting him. Legal experts, people like Lawrence Tribe, they're saying this case hits at the very foundations of the rule of law, the separation of powers.
The fear being, if it can happen to him.
It could potentially happen to anyone. That's the worry.
Could it really extend to U.S. citizens? That seems extreme.
Well, that's the heart of the concern constitutional scholars like Kim Wheel are raising. She points out everyone in the U.S., regardless of status, has rights under the 5th and 14th Amendments, due process rights, notice of what you're accused of, a chance to be heard.
Basic stuff.
Basic guarantees. And she argues Abrego Garcia was clearly deprived of those. The worry is, if the government can ignore a court order and deport someone based on unsubstantiated claims.
What stops them from doing it to a citizen, maybe someone whose citizenship they decide to question after they've deported them?
Exactly. That's the potential slippery slope people are pointing to.
So how has the administration responded to all this? What's El Salvador saying?
The Trump administration's core argument has been that courts can't interfere in foreign policy decisions.
That deportations are foreign policy.
That seems to be the framing. Meanwhile, El Salvador's President Bukele has flatly said returning Abrego Garcia would be preposterous.
So El Salvador won't send him back.
That's their stance. And Secretary of State Rubio, while saying there aren't current plans to deport U.S. citizens, did call El Salvador's offer to accept deportees of any nationality significant.
Any nationality. So the U.S. could potentially send anyone there, regardless of where they're from.
That seems to be the implication of El Salvador's offer, yes. Which, again, sets a very unsettling precedent.
It really does. If the government can illegally deport someone who had a valid protection order based on claims that weren't proven,
it really forces us to ask, what are the limits on executive power? How strong are these due process protections we assume everyone on U.S. soil has?
It's not just about immigration law anymore.
Not at all. It's about the fundamental relationship between the individual and the state and the role of the courts in protecting rights.
So let's try to sum this up. Kilmar Abrego Garcia lived here 14 years, family, kids, no criminal record, had a court order saying he couldn't be sent back to El Salvador because of gang threats. Despite that, deported illegally, the government calls it an administrative error based on an unproven gang allegation in a place he never lived.
Correct.
Now he's stuck in CCOT, this notorious prison in El Salvador, facing danger from the very gang he fled, with apparently no way out.
And the whole situation has blown up into this major legal fight, raising huge questions about due process, executive power, and whether the government can act outside the law if it does so quickly.
Right. Which leaves us and our listeners with a pretty stark thought, doesn't it?
It really does.
What does it mean for the rights and the safety of everyone in the United States if the government can operate like this? Apparently without immediate or clear legal consequences.
Yeah, how does a case like this challenge our basic ideas about justice and the rule of law right here, within our own borders? It's something that affects everyone, regardless of your own background or status.
Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.
That's it for today's episode of A La Mode. We hope it gave you something to think about.
If you liked what you heard, be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode.
We'd love to hear your thoughts. Find us on Blue Sky at A La Mode Pod. Thanks for listening. I'm Madison Taylor.
And I'm Aiden Cole. Until next time,
Stay current and curious.